English translation 559th Contact Tuesday, the 30th of April 2013, 22:31 hours.
Hello, Ptah. You surprise me again, dear friend, because I was not expecting you until tomorrow afternoon. But be greeted and welcome.
Greetings also, dear friend. I have no time tomorrow, so Florina is coming to correct it.
Is good. Then I can go straight to this internet printout that Christian Frainer brought me. It is from a book with the title Man-Made God by a Barbara Walker. It is for an email question. What does it mean? It is a relief from the Inshushinak temple in Susa, Persia, with something similar to a piece of the ancient peace symbol. It is unknown to me. Do you know anything about it?
Yes, it is known to me. It is a section of a relief from the time of the Elamic King Tepti-Humban-Inshushinak. However, the whole relief part is not shown here, but only about the 9th part of the still existing relief. So 2/9 of all parts are missing at the bottom of this extract, while the remaining 6/9 are missing on the left side. On the far left of the still existing relief, a goddess is depicted, in the middle a bull man, that is to say, an animal human or a mythological hybrid being half human being, half bull. This, however, which here looks similar to the spiritual teaching peace symbol, is completely misinterpreted by antiquity researchers, namely as a palm tree. In truth, however, it is an imitation of the old peace symbol, which was still known at the time of King Inshushinak, and which found a modified imitation of the peace symbol as Tree of Peace and Tree of Life.
Thanks for the explanation. The story is not known to me. But because of the Taurus man, the Greek mythology comes to my mind, the legend of the Minotaur, the human being of the bull. At the time of Minos, the king on the island of Crete, he asked the sea god Poseidon for a particularly beautiful and powerful bull to sacrifice to him. Poseidon heard the request, created such a bull and let it rise from the sea. King Minos, however, was so blinded by the beauty of the animal that he kept it for himself, but intended to slaughter another for the sea god. Poseidon, however, became angry and punished the king by casting a spell on Minos' wife for breaking the word, Queen Pasiphae. She fell in love with the bull and commissioned the court artist Daedalus to build a wooden cow, which was hollow inside and covered with fur. When this was done, she climbed into the hollow cow to be mounted and mated with Poseidon's bull, because he liked the work of art and felt attracted to it. Then 9 months later the queen gave birth to a child, a monster, half human being, half bull, the Minotaur. This animal-human child grew up and became big and strong, preferring to eat human beings. But to prevent this Minotaur from causing any harm, the king ordered his master builder Daedalus to build a labyrinth in which the monster was locked up and could not escape. To feed the Minotaur, King Minos had 7 boys and 7 girls kidnapped every 9 years from the city of Athens, which he had subjugated, and then had them taken to Crete and thrown to the monster. One of the young men was Theseus, a son of the sea god Poseidon and stepson of the king of Athens. But the daughter of King Minos, Ariadne, fell in love with him and helped him to kill the monster in the labyrinth. To help Theseus find his way out of the labyrinth, she gave him a wooden spool with a long thread wound around it, which he unwound as he entered the labyrinth and marked his path, which he followed and found on his way back out. But as for your explanation of Persia and the relief, I cannot say anything about it, for the whole thing is unknown to me. Unfortunately, I do not know much of the old Persian history either, but I do know, for example, that the early Aryans lived there, which then spread to India. I also know that before the Aryans in the Neolithic Age, small groups of Stone Age people lived in the Persian highlands as hunters, as your father Svath once explained to me in the 1940s, when he showed me some things in Persia. He himself always called the country Persia, which is what I have remained with, so I used this name when I traveled the country several times in the 1960s. That was also accepted by the people in Persia, and I accepted it. And I still use the name Persia today, although I know that Persia was also called Iran by the Aryans and other inhabitants of the country at an early stage, as an abbreviation of Aran Shar, as the old name was called in the Central Persian language. This old Iranian form of the country name, as Sfath explained at the time, meant Land of the Aryans, although to my knowledge, in the Persian language Farsi, which is the most widespread Persian language in the country today, the term Iran is supposed to mean of noble origin and is directly derived from the Aryans. The old term Persia, as your father explained, dates back to the time of the Achaemenids, who created the first Persian Empire in the 6th century before Emmanuel Chur. From the Greek side, the central area was called Landscape Persis, which to my knowledge today includes the province of Fars around Shiraz. In 1935, if I recall correctly, it was then that Reza Shah Pahlavi, Reza Chan, or whatever his name was, and who was also called Reza Shah the Great, began to modernize some things in Persia, as a result of which he banned the name of Persia and only allowed the name Iran to be used, thus restoring the validity of the country's traditional name. In fact, Reza Shah was a simple soldier before joining the Persian Cossack Brigade, where he quickly worked his way up to become commander-in-chief and then, in the ruler's cabinet, whose name I unfortunately forget, defense minister. Later, he also became prime minister under Ahmad Shah, only to be replaced by the Shah of Persia or Iran. That is what I still know about Persian history, unfortunately, along with very little else.
Reza Shah had the title Sardar Sepa as Supreme Commander, and he was Minister of Defense in the cabinet of Sayyid Zia al-Din Tabatabai.
Thanks, I had forgotten that name. It is also so long ago since the times of Sfath.
But it is amazing that after such a long time you still remember my father's explanations. This is not so self-evident, especially because you had to rebuild a lot of your memory as a result of your severe health breakdown in 1982.
That may well be true, but I think my constant memory exercises also play a big part in this, through which things that had disappeared come to my mind from time to time. Without these exercises, which I do over and over again, many things would probably not come back to my mind.
What is important is your work, which you constantly devote yourself to and which does not let you or your consciousness and memory rest.
I can accept that. But look here, these 2 articles. If you want to read them, please do.
We have already discussed these matters several times, for example at the 391st and the 465th official conversation. Actually, there is nothing more to say about this. For this report of today's interview, you can copy the relevant passages and attach them again as a repeated explanation.
All right, I will do.
391st Contact Report, the 18th of June, 2005, Volume 10, pages 87-88.
Thanks.
Ta reads the article.
What is to be read here I can only confirm in all things. Schizophrenia is inevitable with prolonged use and is also only a transitional form, which ultimately ends in permanent or chronically acute mental consciousness and overall mental disorders. This means that ultimately dementia occurs, which ends in a chronically progressive or progressive degenerative change and thus damage to the brain. In the end, a chronic confusion develops with a loss of acquired cognitive intellectual abilities. Above all, disorders of memory activity and thus of the ability to remember occur, in addition to the fact that, as with the actual dementia at a higher age, personality changes occur as a result of an organ-brain disease. In the worst case, the human being loses his ability to orientate himself, as well as his ability to judge and think in a coordinated manner, which impairs his entire intelligence. In addition, in the case of the previous schizophrenia, mild or severe changes in the personality structure already occur. which has a negative impact on the activities to be carried out, as well as on interpersonal relationships and the social environment as a whole. In the schizophrenic stage caused by drugs such as hashish, behavioral disorders and personality changes, as well as mild and severe depression, which may show psychotic symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions, along with the appearance of aggression, which often leads to uncontrollability and even to destructiveness and fisticuffs, etc.
465th Contact Report, the 7th of May, 2008, Volume 11, page 340.
Look, a telephone reader's question from a man named Wu Chengdang from China. He speaks German and reads our bulletins on the internet and asks whether hashish and marijuana are harmful or not. With your daughter Simya Se and Quetzal, and also with you, I have often spoken about the consequences of intoxicating drugs, including hashish and marijuana, which are considered harmless by many stupid politicians, although these drugs also cause great psychological, consciousness, and brain damage, as you have always explained. However, the advocates of these so-called harmless drugs are not influenced by this. I wonder whether these fools are not themselves addicted to these drugs and whether their brains have already shrunk, which is what these intoxicating drugs do.
That is probably not the case, except perhaps in a few cases. The stupidity of the advocates of hashish and marijuana lies in the fact that they do not know the truth about the harmful effects of these drugs. Marijuana and hashish are very strong psychodrugs, which therefore damage the psyche but also cause severe brain shrinkage, the consequences of which are, among other things, chronic, progressive, and have a degenerative effect on the brain. This means that there is a loss in relation to previously acquired abilities of perception, thinking, and cognition. The loss of these cognitive abilities increasingly causes disturbances with regard to memory, but also with regard to intelligence and judgment. Connected with this is a change in the personality structure as well as in the ability to orientate oneself in the social and activity aspects. Ultimately, psychotic factors such as hallucinations and delusions and possibly also epilepsy develop. And the damage that these drugs also cause is very great, with mental damage and brain shrinkage being just two of the various health problems.
Thanks. In other words, eventually dementia develops, something like mental retardation, if I may say so.
That is rightly said.
Sometimes it happens that the same things are mentioned several times. For my part, I know that we have already talked about it several times. But Bernadette thinks that, as a result of these two articles, we should talk about it again, because then we can add the two articles to this conversation today.
So that's why. I can understand that, even if the articles are not exactly detailed and very valuable.
The newspaper writers are a bit superficial, so their explanations are usually not profound, but rather banal. I also saw this again the day before yesterday when I read an article about how psychopaths behave. The article was so meaningless and banal, also one that Bernadette gave me to read, that the whole thing led me to write an article myself, according to what I know about psychopathy from the explanations of your father Svath and from you. Look here, this is what came out of it.
How to recognize the human being as a psychopath.
A psychopath is a human being without conscience, fear, anxiety, and pity. But this does not mean that he necessarily has to be a brutal criminal, because in reality, this is only determined by a combination of different factors. So this is what determines whether the human being as a psychopath becomes a perpetrator of violence, a thug, bully, a single or multiple murderer, a despot, a tyrant, a ruthless family dictator, a terrorist, a degenerate military ruler or state power, the arbitrary boss of a sect, a company, a group, or a corporation. A psychopath is a cold-bloodedly calculating, domineering, as well as egotistic, egoistic, autocratic, and egocentric human being. The vast majority of men are psychopaths, while women are less so, although many of them are also not immune to psychopathy. Psychopaths are the ones who manage to commit more than half of all degenerated inhumanities and serious crimes. Even though they account for little more than 3.5% of all humanity, a number which is increasing in relation to the growth of overpopulation. This is uncanny, although it must be said that the majority of the population often contributes to the fact that psychopaths are able to live out their degenerations at all. This is particularly the case when people join a religious sect in good faith, often led by a psychopathically predisposed person who keeps his or her believers under strict thumb and discipline, and may even abuse them sexually. It is also the case, however, when psychopaths are elected to be leaders of states, military powers, heads of groups, companies or corporations, etc., and these people are adored, and all inhumanities and injustices are let through to them, and they are not held accountable. The wrong choice of partnership must also be mentioned in relation to male and female family despotism, family dictatorship, and family violence, because no attention is paid to the fact that if the partner is psychopathically predisposed, this inevitably leads to catastrophic family conditions, including scenes of jealousy and hatred, violence and murder, and manslaughter. The reason for this is that the psychopath's brain works differently from that of the human being. But this does not mean that the human beings as psychopaths suffer only disadvantages in everyday life, are only violent, domineering, and despotic, etc., because in certain areas of life, they can even be exceptionally talented and even achieve great things. So they can smash the human being's skull or save his life as a doctor surgeon or as a spontaneous lifesaver. Psychopaths can even be found among academics, such as doctors, psychiatrists, professors, and so-called clergymen, and also among many other professions, such as workers, psychologists, police officers, technicians, researchers, and managers of all kinds, etc., although, of course, only some of them openly express and act out their psychopathy. In truth, many psychopathically burdened people are remarkable and righteous human beings who do their good part for the welfare of their fellow human beings and progress, etc., and who also maintain good family relations. It is this type of psychopathically afflicted person who is also able to keep himself and his psychopathic behavior under control, so that a normal contact with them is possible, and they are also able to fit into the social order and to achieve great positive things. But if the psychopaths are eliminated, there is nothing of remarkable good and positive and righteousness left in them. So the behavior of the psychopathic human being is not simply negative or positive, but rather like a regulator scale whose low and high values determine the current behavior. The lower the scale value is set, the more sociable, humane, and tolerable the behavior is. However, the higher the scale is turned up, the more the psychopathic human being's behaviors of violence, tyranny, dictatorship, sectarianism, power, despotism, terror, jealousy, hatred, and degenerate arbitrary action in many relationships increase. Thus, the various forms of violence and all the strictly psychopathic forms of behavior are not necessarily among the most prominent criteria of the human beings with psychopathic tendencies, nor are the human factors and intelligence which are worthy of recognition. And consequently, they cannot simply be assumed to be positive or strictly negative, because everything is constantly changing, depending on the attitude on the scale between high and low. The fact is, however, that it is these characteristics that determine how the human being develops. If he is psychopathic and also violent, he is likely to become addicted to crime, which is often accompanied by a reluctance to work. Theft, lies, fraud, and slander, as well as serious crimes up to murder, sadistic torture, and tyranny, etc., are not rare. However, if, instead of violence or all other psychopathic evils, the profound intelligence of a psychopathic human being comes to the fore, Then they turn into doctors and surgeons, directors, bosses, or politicians, which of course does not mean that every human being who is a doctor, surgeon, director, boss, policeman, pedagogue, or politician, etc., is a psychopath. The situation is different. However, with regard to the human beings who are leaders of religious or political sects, because they are without exception addicted to various forms of psychopathy and their behavior is unpredictable, as are many of their followers and believers. In all the behavior of the human being with psychopathy, however, the way in which the appropriate combination of the various psychopathic factors is manifested is of fundamental importance in order to make a career in good or evil, negative or positive. Psychopaths have feelings in their way, so they do not allow them to get in the way. And where feelings are missing, there is also a lack of compassion. So the human being with a psychopathic disposition reacts like a heartless machine in certain situations. So whether the psychopath is concerned with himself or with the well-being of another human being, he lacks any feelings at all because they are considered to be insecure and totally absent. Feelings are simply extinguished by already shaping and controlling the thoughts accordingly. Consequently, also the whole brain is focused on them and gives way to an unscrupulousness. This is automatically accompanied by the fact that fear and anxiety and all other factors which could hinder one's own interest or work are also ruthlessly eliminated. However, it is precisely this: to push thoughts pregnant with feelings and compassion into the background, that is precisely a factor that enables the psychopathic human being to achieve above-average peak performance. Psychopaths, and it must always be assumed that they are either male or female psychopaths, have particularly strong characteristics as they possess overwhelming charm and an unusually self-confident appearance, as well as an extraordinary capacity for strategic thinking. It is these qualities in particular that make it so incredibly difficult to recognize psychopaths as such. They are practically perfected to use the positive character traits as a facade into fake emotions and feelings that are not their own in order to remain unrecognized as psychopaths among their fellow human beings. Consequently, it is also difficult to see through and recognize them as such. It is also peculiar to them that they have no inhibitions, and therefore they are hardly or not at all intimidated, neither by the female nor the male sex, nor by threats. This is precisely because they are not open to fear or anxiety, but simply filter it out of their thoughts and feelings. This is why their fear and emotion center, which is located in the area of the amygdala, usually does not become active at all, with the result that psychopaths hardly or not at all perceive threats and even dangers as such. Because psychopaths are unaware of thoughts, feelings, and other impulses of fear and anxiety, they have an extremely high level of resilience and exceptionally strong nerves, which probably led to the word nerves of steel. And since psychopaths are very often hired for military warfare, for dangerous security services, and as legionnaires to indulge their negative psychopathic tendencies, they are better suited for this than any other human being. In such organizations, the psychopathic qualities are then cultivated even further through brutal training tactics and inhuman training courses, etc., until the human being finally becomes a ruthless and merciless killing machine. If the human being is only a partial psychopath in such training methods, then his thoughts and feelings as well as his psyche are broken. But usually not by physical violence, but by threats which directly affect the substance of life, because literal threats usually bounce off the human being absolutely ineffectively. So in warlike military and dangerous security services, as well as in a legion, threats are not simply made by words alone, but by infamously pretended or actually life-threatening actions, and this in order to trim the candidates. However, weak partial psychopaths, as well as normal human beings, do not pass such psychotests and psychotrimmings. While for real psychopaths, such inhuman endurance tests are nothing more than a game or a need for toughening up. Yet the whole thing of being fearless and fearless has absolutely nothing to do with courage. Because if there is neither fear nor dread, then courage is also not necessary. This means no more and no less than that the human being who shows courage in any way also knows fear and anxiety, and that he is normal and therefore not psychopathic. And only the human being who is normal is able to recognize and correctly assess a danger through reason and understanding. The psychopath who only acts in the present does not imagine any future scenarios, contrary to the psychopath who does not give priority to violence, but to his intelligence and acts with foresight. In any case, it is that a psychopath always focuses on the success of his actions and behavior. In this way, he convinces himself of the success of his actions, which strengthens his self-confidence. But in the end, the psychopath doesn't care about what really comes out of his actions and behavior, because his motto is simply, I do it, and that's it. This is a mentality trait that gives the psychopath another advantage, and that is that he never puts anything on the back burner. As a result, everything that is done in a psychopathic way is much more effective. Well, effective fact is that a psychopath can be consorted or lived with for decades without ever knowing or experiencing that he is a partially psychopathic or a slightly stronger psychopath. But this is possible because a psychopath is able to hide his dark side through hard control or through appropriate behavior such as cheating, lying, manipulation, and slander, as well as actions, etc., with specific factors appearing to a different degree in practically every female or male psychopath, depending on the combination of the different psychopathic characteristics. These combinations are very varied and take hundreds and thousands of forms, so that each of the human being's psychopathies is different from that of another. Of course, there are certain psychopathic characteristics that are similar or even identical, such as those listed below as 12 special characteristics. 1. The psychopath is also a perfect sneaky provocateur and observer, so he makes his fellow human beings show their emotions. In this way, he is able to decipher their movements, gait, body language, facial expressions, and weaknesses, and instinctively grasp what their counterpart is like in terms of thoughts and feelings. 2. It is possible for the psychopath to recognize whether someone was abused as a child or is still being sexually abused, whether he is independent or in bondage to others, etc. 3. A psychopath knows perfectly well how to unscrupulously and credibly put the worst lies and slander into the world. 4. The psychopath is able to pretend sympathy and compassion and hypocritically put himself on the same level as his victims. 5. The psychopath has a broad actionism and is able to deal with practically any situation. The moment he has developed a strategy, he also puts it into action immediately because slow action and boredom are an evil abomination to him. As a result, the psychopath is always looking for variety and something new, no matter what the cost and the evil and negative or even life-threatening consequences for the human being. 6. The psychopath is unscrupulous and has no guilty conscience because he has no thoughts, feelings, or emotions that could lead to conscientious impulses. A psychopath can unscrupulously sacrifice his own family for his ideals and bring misery and need upon friends and acquaintances or upon entire peoples. He can rob, steal, cheat, deceive or murder other human beings without hesitation and without the slightest conscientious impulse, because his focus is always exclusively on his own interests and his own well-being. 7. The psychopath cultivates ice-cold reasoning and is himself of an ice-cold nature, which he hides behind a perfectly played character of charm, sincerity, kindness, sociability, and understanding, etc. Consequently, his psychopathic nature is usually not recognized by his fellow human beings. This masquerade only collapses when he is exposed as a psychopath, when it does not work, or when he has reached his real goal. As a psychopath, he has the quality to bring everything he also does and approaches to perfection. 8. The psychopath is an extreme manipulator who knows perfectly well how to manipulate his fellow human beings psychologically by persuasion. In psychology, 4 code forms have been defined for this purpose. 1. Contrast code. 2. Pacing code. 3. Lie code. 4. Censorship code. One form of manipulation usually takes place through the so-called contrast code, in which the psychopath presents to his counterpart what he really wants and desires from him as the lesser evil. So it happens, for example, that when he demands something, he then does it to a much greater extent than he really wants it. And being well aware of this, the other person will not go for it. In this way of asking for more, however, he can reduce his demand to less so that he is then granted the lesser evil of what he really wanted. Another form, the pacing code, works in such a way that the psychopath reflects the statements, worries, and wishes, etc. of the fellow human being, or fraudulently reflects them on himself, and thus pretends to be deeply sympathetic. This has the effect that the fellow human being feels understood and imagines the psychopath as a close or even the closest confidant. The psychopath has thus won everything and guides his victim like a dog on a leash with good advice, etc., that is intentional only for him. But this requires that he knows everything and anything about his victim, so he listens to him in a nasty way until he knows everything necessary. And there is a good example of how this happens with those irresponsible life counselors and clairvoyants who are active in life counseling programs on television or advertise their supposed wisdom in newspapers and magazines. In reality, however, they first listen to their life counselor seekers and then give them good advice and prophecies about what has been lured out of them unnoticed. However, the psychopath must be very careful not to exaggerate because one single false statement or reaction can make everything fall apart. The lie code is that the psychopath tells his fellow human beings what is necessary to manipulate them. From a purely religious believing point of view, this is done, for example, by every cult boss who makes everything clear to his believing flock that makes them delusional. Since the psychopath is very good at feigning false feelings, he is also very convincing. But the peculiarity of this is that he always remains calm in his lies and is very careful not to exaggerate, because otherwise the game could be blown up. A special feature of the fearless and fearless psychopath is the fact that for him, unscrupulous lying is the easiest way to cast a spell on his fellow human beings. But this is no wonder, because as notorious or pathological liars, they do nothing or hardly anything else. The so-called censorship code shows the manipulative behavior of the psychopath and is in truth a true art through which he makes his fellow human beings completely dependent on himself. In doing so, the psychopath proceeds in such a way that he prevents, for example, his victim from receiving information not from other human beings, but only from himself. He does this in a radical way and censors everything that can approach his victim from sources other than himself. In doing so, the psychopath makes other human beings look bad and puts them in a bad light, often also building up intrigues, lies, and slander against the victim's fellow human beings. The psychopath then usually appears as a savior in distress and plays everything to his victim in such a way that he is the only person he trusts. This is the moment when the victim is comprehensively controlled by the psychopath with good advice etc. that only serves himself and ultimately drives the victim into distress and misery, as well as offside and into disadvantages, ultimately possibly also into a psychological breakdown. From a purely psychological point of view, There are, of course, various other forms than those described, because the human being's possibilities in this respect are in fact practically unlimited. It is also true that the psychopath is able to read and decipher even the smallest gestures and movements of the other person, so that he or she is able to grasp and understand the thoughts and feelings of the others, which are then unscrupulously and manipulatively exploited. This is a pretense of compassion, which is usually only used to gain trust, which is then shamefully abused by controlling, deceiving, and exploiting others at will, and always doing exactly what the psychopath wants. 9. The psychopath's attention is always highly concentrated. He can switch off or simply fade out all other distracting and disturbing factors in his brain to concentrate on what he is currently dealing with. If a task or anything else is being done, then every detail is specifically kept in mind and used to his own advantage. This extraordinary concentration only diminishes again when the goal is achieved. 10. The psychopath is incredibly self-confident and self-centered, and therefore expresses his superiority to his fellow human beings with every gesture and word he utters. Consequently, modesty is out of the question for him. If he is in any way a leader, no matter how or where he is also extraordinarily clear and cold-blooded in dealing with crisis situations. So he does not panic, but proves how competent he is, which is not only in the positive case, but also in the negative one, whereby his addiction to power and domination and under certain circumstances, his cruelty also openly come into play. 11. The psychopath has an almost frightening resilience, and he knows neither fear nor dread. No matter whether he is in a hopeless situation, whether he is about to fall into a deep abyss, whether he is threatened or tortured, or whether he is facing the executioner or a firing squad. The impending danger as such is not perceived at all by the psychopath's brain, so that he is incredibly resilient and stress-resistant in practically every respect. This also leads to extreme optimism in the psychopath, so that even defeats cannot stop him from doing what he has once started, because he believes he is always victorious. Everything also makes him completely insensitive to psychological threats, tricks and tests, etc., and he therefore relentlessly pursues his stubbornly determined plans. 12. Since the psychopath is unscrupulous, he knows neither mercy, remorse, nor forgiveness, and consequently he also exploits and tortures his victims without hesitation and without any compassion to the point of bloodshed, driving them through harassment into the most serious psychological disorders and illnesses, and possibly even into a state of threatening insanity or suicide. Such psychopathic machinations, which are devoid of any human being, destroy families, friendships, and working relationships, as well as companies and corporations, often causing wars which bring misery, distress, death, and destruction to millions of people. Sim Yase Silver Star Center, the 28th of April, 2013, 16:30 hours Billy.
What you read to me is, as usual, nothing negative about it. But may I see the 2 articles which are the origin of your explanations?
At least the one I have here. Wait, yes, here. You can read this one. The other one I got from Bernadette, and of course I gave it back to her. It was even more banal than this one. Please, if you want to read it yourself.
Thanks.
Ata reads.
It is really what you say. The whole thing is meaningless and banal. It is unfortunate that such important topics are published as reading material in this way, because they do not bring great insights to the reader, and therefore also no benefit.
It is the same with journals and newspapers, but often also with books, because the Frenchmen and women who talk about such important subjects in a long-winded, meaningless and banal way do not understand enough of the whole thing. And if more detailed and somewhat expert writing is done, then on the other hand, the people who edit the books will cut everything short and mutilate it in a meaningless and banal way. It is especially these editors who are unaware of the necessity of certain detailed explanations which make a topic correct, interesting, understandable, valuable, appealing, and comprehensible for the reader. In addition, they are usually absolute laymen with regard to the things and subjects they edit, so they are also unable to judge what explanations are important and need to be explained more clearly and in greater detail, because they themselves are not professionally educated with regard to what is written or simply cannot comprehend the value of more detailed interpretations. For this reason, the editors also take the liberty of simply reshaping sentences, which often completely changes the sense of the sentence and no longer corresponds to what it is supposed to express. But there is no need to discuss this, for the human beings who act in this way are high-handed and arrogant, believing that they have fed the art of writing with shovels, following the delusion that they always have to contribute their own formulations. There is nothing to be said against it if human beings who are unaccustomed to writing, or those who are also perhaps at war with grammar, write or describe things that need to be grammatically corrected. In fact, there are unfortunately enough human beings who do not understand the part of linguistics that deals with linguistic forms and their function in sentences, and who are not familiar with the laws and structure of language. It is unfortunate that some of the human beings who are not familiar with grammar get upset and complain when their written things have to be grammatically corrected in order to make sure that everything is correct. Of course, in the heat of the moment, even those who know grammar can sometimes make mistakes, especially when writing in a hurry, but this has nothing to do with a lack of knowledge of grammar.
This is all well what you say, and I understand what you are saying. But just now I was thinking about what we discussed on April 20th, and I listed 11 important points. What remains to be said concerns the spiritual teaching letters. Under no circumstances should and must these be translated into foreign languages, but must remain in the original language, German. All foreign languages are so deficient that the contents of the teaching letters cannot be translated correctly, as is also the case with all other teaching texts. Although incorrect translations of the spiritual teaching letters would be much more serious and damaging than is the case with all other writings and books. The mere fact that the English translation of the Goblet of the Truth shows very questionable language and interpretation deficiencies is a thing that makes the given goal of the teaching not to be taken seriously anymore. Yes, to say the least, it creates a certain ridiculousness. This is precisely because English unworthy terms and words must be used, which do not correspond to the value of what is expressed in the German language.
That is unfortunately the case, I know. The whole thing is made even worse by the fact that know-it-alls who believe themselves to be proficient in the German language constantly want to correct everything that is translated by Marianne, Willem and me, and by your language experts with other English terms and words. It is to be said that not only are these people not sufficiently proficient in the German language, but that they also do not understand the deeper meaning of the German terms and words and therefore cannot comprehend their value. But this is where I come up with the question: what do you think of my books and writings when you distribute them?
Very many of our people have learned the German language and are therefore learning the textbooks and the spiritual textbooks according to your German language, which you so excellently present. For all those who do not know the German language, all your written works have been and will continue to be translated into our intercosmic language, which is spoken by all our peoples without exception. The only exceptions to this are in the area of the Outer Federation, where this language is also very widespread. The intercosmic Kosan and our Iranic language Aran, as well as our Playaran language Sarat, are based on our very old original language, which, as you know, is the real origin of the Old German and therefore of the German language of today. All our languages are therefore equated with German in every term and word, so there is no difference in this respect. This means that every term and word in the German language has absolutely the same meaning and value in all our languages. Consequently, there is no difference in this respect.
After all, Swiss German is equal to German, and as you once said, it is also a language in its own right, and therefore not a dialect.
That is so, and that is also how our language scholars interpret it. Swiss German is a language of its own, which, like the German language, also has different dialects.
But super smart people always think that Swiss German is a German dialect.
This is evidence of insufficient knowledge, because our highly educated language scholars probably know this better than better knowing, and in this respect, uneducated Earth humans.
I am sure you are right. Unfortunately, there are many know-it-alls on Earth who put false information into the world and thereby spread misinformation.
Such an action is not possible with us, because there is no such thing as know-it-all, because all knowledge is only accepted as truth, according to the effective reality and its facts.
It would be nice if this were also the case with us on Earth, because then no sects and religions would exist either. But only the existence of reality and its truth, which would also prevent a great deal of evil, such as wars, terror, hatred of all kinds, discord, lack of love and crime, etc.
There are indeed many connections. But actually, Quetzal should already be here, because he is out in the field and looking around at the vegetation.
Ah, is the little rascal also here again? I am also happy to see him again.
As I said, he should have been here already, about 15 minutes ago. But here I am, a little late, but still in time before you have finished your conversation. I am pleased to welcome you, so greetings, my friend.
Likewise be welcome. I am very pleased that you are finding your way here once again. Although I was just about to say something about the conversation with Ptah regarding the know-it-all, I can also do that later. I am really happy to see you, Quetzal.
As I said before, this is also the case for me, but unfortunately my joy is also clouded.
Why is that?
After quite some time, I have once again found the necessary time to look around in the area. Regrettably, I have noticed many very unpleasant inaccuracies in the tree and bush planting, which Ptah and Florina have pointed out to me, which is why I have come here today.
That at night? You hardly recognize anything.
You're forgetting our lighting, which makes us see everything as if it were daylight.
Right, sorry. What kind of unpleasantness have you noticed?
It is about the fact that many bushes and trees have been cut off the vital branches and shoots so radically that they can no longer develop their splendor. Several bushes have been cut back so radically that they are no longer able to develop their fragrant flowers, while the golden elm opposite the house has also been so radically stripped of its branches that it is shameful. Many thuja trees have also been radically robbed of their tops, so that they can no longer grow to their intended height of 5 to 6 meters. The cherry laurel plants have also had their branches cut unnecessarily and radically, which means that the density is no longer sufficient to provide privacy from the house. If I, for my part, were to deal with the bushes, plants, and trees in this radical way in my own home, then my facilities would be completely disfigured, as is also the case here in the center. The whole of the radical pruning of the bushes and plants corresponds neither to a professional manner nor to the necessary understanding to take care of the bushes and trees in an appropriate and correct way with a certain affectionate attachment to plants. This must change immediately, although it is questionable whether this will regenerate in the foreseeable future, which has been radically damaged by unprofessional care. In my opinion, the person who has carried out this radicalism must not continue to be responsible for the care of the bushes and trees, and consequently another person must be appointed to do so. If none of the members of the group can be found to do so, then a specialist from a bush and tree nursery should be appointed immediately, because it is no longer acceptable for the bush and tree growth to be so crassly and radically dismembered and disfigured. The care of plants, Bushes and trees requires the appropriate knowledge and also the necessary understanding for thinning out, but also a love for them, so that they can be cared for and maintained in this way in every respect. Bushes, trees, and plants are also living beings that must be respected in their existence, and therefore must not be tormented. And at least the bushes and trees here on the center grounds are tormented by their radically unprofessional treatment.
It is all very unfortunate, I know.
That is the case, yes, and that is why I am instructing you to immediately see to it that the care and maintenance of the bushes and trees is taken over by another group person or is carried out by an expert from the bush and tree sector.
By this you mean an expert in the bush and tree plant sector, what we call a tree nursery.
That is the meaning of my words.
Finding someone from the group might be difficult because we don't have a professional in that field either. When I think like that, maybe only Hartmut would come to mind, because as far as I know, he used to tend bushes and trees at his father's place, and also pruned them.
Then ask him about it.
Well, I will, but only after I have called up your instructions and your explanations and have put them in writing. If that is all right with you?
It is acceptable to me. A change is urgently needed and inevitable, because the bushes and plants are suffering and threaten to perish if they are radically desecrated in the way they have been until now. That is all I have to say. Goodbye.
And away he is, and he seems pretty upset.
Indeed he is. Yes, he is even angry, which is why he is also immediately gone.
That is to be understood.
That also applies to me.
There is no point in being angry and upset, so let us get off this subject now, and move on to what we were talking about before Quetzal appeared. It was all about know-it-all, and I would like to add the following. If the effective reality and its truth had been recognized and realized from time immemorial, and if it had also been recognized today that the know-it-all and the often associated lust for power and lust, for power of many people brought and continue to bring immense damage and catastrophes over the earth and for human beings, then humanity on earth would have had a better life, and would also have had it today and in the future. This is especially due to all the positive and valuable progress in medicine, technology, and various sciences, which have brought the general standard of living and quality of life to a high level. All the extraordinary natural disasters and wars caused by overpopulation, as well as many diseases and epidemics and various exterminations of all kinds of animals and plants could have been, and still could have been avoided, as well as the destruction of nature and the climate. The evil consequences of globalization would never have come about, such as the worldwide spread of human and animal diseases and epidemics, and also the worldwide introduction of plants, insects, animals, and creatures from foreign countries, which spread unchecked and displace indigenous genera and species and lead to their extinction. In this way, globalization is truly a catastrophe that cannot be reversed and will bring great misfortune to all mankind, and also to flora and fauna. This is also contributed to by the increasing numbers of refugees who are migrating from many countries where there is state terror or war, unemployment, torture, famine, land destruction and oppression, etc. This is compounded by a new colonialism, which consists of states and corporations in foreign countries buying up entire landscapes, exploiting their resources or cultivating the land in order to profit in their own country and produce food for a rapidly growing population. This involves drilling for natural gas and petroleum on the land they have leased or bought up, and building highly subsidized factories and other production facilities, as well as dangerous nuclear power stations and other energy-generating plants, because the inexorable growth in energy demand caused by overpopulation can earn billions of euros, francs, dollars, pounds, and yen, etc. Agro-fuel refineries are springing up like poisonous mushrooms, and it is getting worse and worse because the irresponsibly growing overpopulation is constantly screaming for more fuel for cars, trucks, ships, machinery, aircraft, and criminal motorsports, etc. And in this respect, it is demonstrable that more than half of all land rented or purchased, as well as the world's agricultural land use, is used for the agri-fuel industry. And this is done by using land and soil, also by many irresponsible and profiteering farmers, to grow crops from which agrofuel is produced. Instead of grain, maize, and other crops that could serve as food for the human beings and satisfy much of the world's hunger. But it is also the plastics industry that is involved in all this, because it too is keen to extract new substances for its own purposes from food crops, because plastics have become so important that it is impossible to imagine life without them. The financial, energy, and chemical industries have also opened up the market for all kinds of exhaust and greenhouse gases, as it has been discovered that these gases can be captured and turned into new fuels, etc. And in order to get hold of enough of these gases, land and soil is once again being haggled to grow plants that can be used to produce exhaust and greenhouse gases. The greenhouse gas CO2 plays a special role in this process because it is bound in plants, leaves, roots, and tree trunks as well as in the soil. And if it is collected, countless billions of dollars can be made if these gases can be used again in one form or another. And in order to do all this, land and large estates are expropriated from the populations of various countries. The populations of those countries, however, to whom their land is expropriated and leased or sold to foreign states, starve to death, die of thirst, disease, and epidemics, and fall into misery and misery. The corporations and states that seize foreign land in this way have created new colonies for themselves and also continue to do so. A race for ownership of land and property has effectively begun around the world, and those governments and speculators who lease or sell land to foreign states and corporations make enormous profits, as do those who lease or buy the land and property. And all this happens on the one hand in the course of irresponsible and criminal globalization, and on the other hand as a result of the enormous and constantly growing overpopulation, which is the real origin of the whole thing. Today, in the third millennium, the trade, lease, and sale of land is much more profitable than the mining of gold, diamonds, and rare earths. Today, the big business is for the land-rich continents, such as Africa, Brazil, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. But sooner or later, Australia must also be considered, as well as farms in Europe, etc., which are closed down due to disease or old age because they can no longer be farmed. Others, however, are often simply sold off for profit and used by the buyers to make horrendous profits. The hunt for the world's soil, for the fields, for the small and large estates, claims an enormous number of victims among the population, the animal and wildlife world, and the flora. But the unscrupulous and criminal investment bandits don't care, because in their calculations only the horrendous profit they make counts. Human lives play no role in this, nor do they care that the human beings' livelihoods and the fauna and flora's livelihoods are destroyed, or that families are uprooted and destroyed. The consequence of all this is also that vast areas of land are becoming impoverished, and that the political stability of many countries is being undermined, just as all decent livelihood opportunities for the affected populations are sinking ever deeper and ending in misery, and death. Land is particularly sought after where prices are still low, such as in Africa and Brazil. But also in expensive Europe, soil hunting and even a correct soil frenzy is going on, because there, too, the criminal and profit-greedy soil speculators are busy at work, looching the land from the landowners, of course, for corresponding cash, which the likewise money-greedy owners of the native crumbs cannot resist. What is also frightening about the whole of the worldwide land hunting is that it is being competed for by states where the ownership of land is a question of survival of the own population. This is particularly the case in states which have such an exuberant mass overpopulation which goes beyond all norms, such as China and India. China is also the state which is one of the largest tenants and buyers in the world land market, because at home, the population can only be offered a minimum of cultivable land. This is both because the booming cities and large villages and industrialization are devouring more and more fertile land, while the leaching of the soil and destruction of vegetation are also causing more and more desertification. The shortage of drinking water is also a huge problem, however, which affects not only China, but many other countries as well. In many countries, mainly in third world countries, it is often the fault of corporations which, for their industries tap the water from the population and poison the flowing backwater to such an extent that it becomes lethal. However, it is not only China that is facing huge overpopulation and food problems, but also India, where there is also a shortage of water. The biggest river, the Ganges, is a deadly broth. Because corpses are dumped, suicides are committed, all rubbish is dumped in it, etc. Clean drinking water is a scarce commodity, as is also the case in China and in various African countries. But this is of no concern to those in charge of the corporations and all the profit-making industries. There are also problems in industrialized countries, such as Japan, where the mountains and the sea mean that there is little room for agriculture. This state already imports about 65 to 70% of all important food from abroad. Japan is thus more dependent on imports from agricultural markets than other industrialized countries. The situation is similar in South Korea, where only very small farms are farmed, usually less than a football field in size, which is usually not even enough to feed the family of several people who cultivate the small piece of land with hard manual labor and without machinery. Egypt is also unable to supply its own population with grain, because not enough wheat, etc. can be produced in the alluvial deposits of the Nile, just as it is absolutely impossible in the desert due to lack of water. And where there is water, more of it is pumped out than streams, rivers, and the rain can supply. Egypt is buying new land on the Nile in order to cultivate it with grain, etc., because it does not want to be dependent on the ever more unpredictable world market. But this will certainly not solve the problem in the long term, as it will also not be the case in South America, Russia and the follower states, Southeast Asia and many other countries, because sooner or later wars for water and land will roll over the earth as a result of the continuing overpopulation, with disastrous consequences. And there is already water stress around groundwater and running water, such as from the major rivers Colorado, Amazon, Ganges, Tigris, Euphrates, Mekong, and Nile, etc., which already affects around 50% of the global water reservoir. Chronic water shortage threatens to turn more and more areas of once fertile and green land into deserts. There is already corruption and greed for land and property, as is particularly the case in Congo, but also in Ethiopia, Kenya, Liberia, Mozambique, Nigeria, Zambia, Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda, etc. Particularly in the former colonies mentioned above, those in power are stealing more and more land from the people and selling it to foreign states to enrich themselves. This while the populations are starving in need and misery, without water and food, sick, miserable, fading and displaced, and dying. The World Bank, together with its subsidiaries International Financial Corporation IFC and Foreign Investment Advisory Services FIAS, is also to blame for all of this. The World Bank, together with its subsidiaries International Financial Corporation IFC and Foreign Investment Advisory Services FIAS, creates attractive and all-round secure investment opportunities for financially strong investors, often with bizarre consequences. In Pakistan, for example, such investment activity has led to the conclusion of an agreement that the government, over and above the knowledge of the people, has concluded a land lease agreement with Saudi Arabia, in which Pakistan is guaranteed military support. And this against its own people if it should turn out that riots would occur in the case of grain deliveries bypassing the homes of the poor. The World Bank, therefore, is at the forefront of the money-making process in land and land transactions, as is also the case with other international institutions. So it is not only the corporations and speculators and the money and greedy, obsessed, power-hungry regimes of the various states. And what the World Bank is fabricating is that it describes the land and land for sale as an action that would be in the interest and good of the respective countries and governments. But if we look at the soil in general, it is the very basis of human nutrition, and that it has already become very scarce for the insane majority of the still rampant overpopulation for food, and that it will continue to become scarcer and scarcer, must be obvious even to the most stupid, even to those morbidly stupid people who think that the earth and its fauna and flora, as well as all of nature and the climate, could support another billion human beings. Soil is becoming increasingly scarce and increasingly destroyed. partly because of the way industrial agriculture deals with it, not just with simple machines, but with those born of megalomaniacal gigantism. In this way, the mass machines compact the soil, making it impermeable and infertile, thus destroying the Earth's inner world of organisms necessary for the fertility of the soil, but also destroying the flora, and also wiping out the fauna, because their means of life are destroyed. The unlimited use of fertilizers such as nitrogen, potassium, and phosphate also contributes to this, without which industrialized agriculture and horticulture would not be possible. The criminal use of chemicals to combat harmful organisms, etc., also contributes to the destruction of the soil and of flora and fauna. In addition, there are droughts and heat waves which destroy fertile soil and its organisms. In modern times, these droughts and heat waves, like the disastrous storms, are also due to the effects of mad overpopulation. These events have also caused the world's granaries, such as Russia and the USA, to fear for their own food supplies. But it is mainly the human beings of the third world countries who have to fear for their food. But despite this fact, a lot of food is also thrown away carelessly. In the industrialized countries, about half of all food is thrown away from the field to the plate, with abundance tempting on the one hand, but also the absurdity of the alleged expiry dates printed on all products. In spite of need, hunger, and misery, things are not much better in the so-called developing countries. This is because, as a result of ailing and corrupt structures, the majority of all harvests between the field, arable land, or garden are simply lost or spoiled. However, it is very difficult to remedy this situation and change it for the better, because the necessary knowledge, will, and initiative are lacking. There is no self-initiative at all, not even in the industrialized countries, and especially in these countries only those things are being worked out which combat the symptoms alone, but not the effective factors. Self-commitment in third world countries is illusory, because as long as the hand is filled with relief supplies without having to work for it, no self-initiative is created. In addition to this, those who would have to develop self-initiative and self-commitment also fail to do so because they see, experience, and realize that they themselves only have to fight for bare survival, while the bankers, speculators, and the powerful of their countries pocket billions in profits for themselves, living in all imaginable luxury and in joy and glory. But this leads to insurrection, terror, and war, and all this smolders underground until the smoldering embers turn into fire and the resulting catastrophe becomes inevitable.
All that you say is the truth, and that you say it is entirely in my mind. But now, dear friend, it is late, and so I must say goodbye again, for I still have an urgent matter to attend to which I have to deal with. Therefore, farewell, dear friend.
Take care, Pa, my friend. Farewell to you also.